Before we begin the video, this will include major spoilers for Star Wars Outlaws. With that being said, let's dive in. The intent of this video is not to determine whether or not Star Wars Outlaws is a good game, as that is subjective and completely up to the player. I am arguing as to whether or not it played it too safe. Now, there are a number of things that Outlaws does differently from other Ubisoft open world titles. There is no need to hunt for towers to unlock sections of the map. The moment you land on a planet, the map is opened up to you. This allows the player to freely explore instead of hunting for specific points, which is something I really appreciated, as it is a change from the established formula. I would consider its RPG systems light, which includes the gear crafting, weapon upgrades, and ability trees. In fact, I really liked Outlaw's approach to acquiring abilities in this game. It is objective based and requires the player to first find a mentor and then complete specific objectives to unlock those abilities. This allows the player to familiarize themselves with the different mechanics, and I believe that almost every ability acquired is useful for the player, so that's good stuff there. The gameplay mechanics found here are serviceable, with some, like the shipboard combat and platforming, being very entertaining, but the gunplay and stealth, while having good ideas, are pretty shallow and are far too dependent on systems that either work or don't. Picking up secondary weapons in firefights is a novel idea. In fact, I really like this idea because it makes these firefights more exciting, but the execution found here is half-baked. Dropping weapons is way too easy, and this can be frustrating during intense firefights. Stealth is fine for the most part, even though the AI is very stupid, and the entire thing is really dependent on Nyx, who just so happens to be the best thing about Outlaws, and no, I will not have any debate about that. But Nyx also breaks any real challenge found in stealth. He is the get out of jail free card and can be instantly used to get out of a bind. While I appreciate the small changes that Outlaws made to certain established formulas that Ubisoft had relied upon over the years, it was clear from the gameplay that there were just certain elements that were clearly within the publisher's wheelhouse. It's not that the gameplay isn't fun, but you've seen this before, and it can become really repetitive, and this includes the fact that stealth missions always lead to explosive endings, which, after a while, can get stale. It felt like developer Massive tried to implement enough changes to stand out, but instead, you got Watch Dogs in space. Granted, I liked Watch Dogs, but like Star Wars Outlaws, this was a game that was supposed to live in the gray, but instead opted for the safe and familiar settings found in other Ubisoft titles. Where Outlaws ultimately falls into the safe category is in the Syndicate System, KVS, and its narrative. So the Syndicate System should have been something that really separates Outlaws from any other open world Ubisoft title. Your standing with these organizations matter in the sense that they affect your access to certain areas and determine the way that other Syndicate members treat you. This system should have been a game changer, but instead it comes off as shallow and one that you can easily game because earning favor with all these different organizations is really easy. There are opportunities everywhere to correct your standings, and I really feel like there should have been real consequences for pitting one organization against the other. But it takes a lot to really force one of these syndicates to dislike you, and even then, the impact on the game is minimal. And this really surprised and disappointed me, as there are some missions that feature some really strong narrative moments. Your conversations with some of the heads of these organizations sound like they're going to have far-reaching consequences for the galaxy. I remember after completing a mission for Jabba, ND5 states that leaving the planet could lead to our deaths. So I decided to test the waters and just fast travel to Tashara because there was a mission available that I really wanted to do. I fully expected to die. I really did. I wanted to see if the threats being made would translate, and they actually don't. Instead, I was met with text that stated I escaped Jabba. I checked to see if it had impacted my standing with the actual syndicate, and it was minimal. It took me 1 or 2 broker missions to get back in good standings so I could travel freely. That was it, and like other syndicate heads, I would not hear from them unless I wanted to, which is a far cry from how the game introduces these syndicates and makes it seem like they're going to heavily impact the game. What I think is funny is that The game really tries to warn you about this. They really try to drive this home that you will be hunted. So my assumption is that if I left the planet normally and I just headed out into space, that yeah, I would actually be hunted down, that I would be prevented from leaving because I owed Jabba. But if you can circumvent that through fast travel, then what's the point of even saying that? And then if it just ends up completing the mission for you anyway, and you just turn out to be in somewhat poor standings with the Syndicate, then who cares? Now, the Syndicate system isn't what I would consider new because other Ubisoft titles have similar systems that included factions, but here, at least on the surface, it looks like we are getting a system that would directly impact proceedings in the game as we went along, rather than providing a pathway to a different ending, which, by the way, you don't have. The Syndicate system instead just acts like previous titles and comes off as really shallow. Yes, you won't get attacked in Syndicate-controlled areas, but the impact on your work is really minimal. You can get away pretty quickly. It was just really disappointing because every time you complete a mission for one of the major heads, Kay always reflects on her decisions, which to me kind of seemed out of place because Kay has been living for so long on the opposite side of the law, and you would think that by now, especially because she tries to come off as savvy, that she would know who the different syndicates are and what they can actually do to her. It's just one of those things that just feels like a weird misstep in terms of the writing. Speaking of Kay, her character frustrated me, and it's not that she's unlikable, and it's not like she doesn't grow as the game progresses. It's that she continuously fails upwards and does not learn from the multiple betrayals that she frequently experiences. Now look, it's okay if Kay is supposed to represent the normal person finding themselves in outstanding circumstances in a very dangerous galaxy, but when you're placing her in increasingly difficult situations and she only gets by because she gets saved at the last moment by someone else, it makes the character underwhelming. Now look, I love the fact that she's inquisitive, but for someone in her position to not know how the galaxy works is really unbelievable. She's not on the Imperial side, that's very clear. She's not on the Rebellion side either. But if she is living in the gray and has been operating in that for quite some time because that's being shown in the different cutscenes and the different conversations, you would think that this individual who has done everything in their power to survive up until this point would be more hardened and savvy, but instead you get someone who's fairly naive and it just makes no sense. The fact that choices in this game do not shape her character is a massively missed opportunity, because why even bother with having this illusion of choice if it's not going to affect the way that Kay views the galaxy? It's clear that through her dialogue that in the moment she's affected by what just happened, but it does not carry over afterward. It just comes off as lazy and she just moves on far too quickly. Kay gets betrayed so many times in a game where she is constantly dealing with criminals that her not learning from these mistakes is insane. I understand that she is young, but she is super easy to manipulate, and the fact that she survives some of these situations where death is a certainty makes her character hard to root for as I neared the end of the game. If you're going to have a set character in a game, we are constantly living in the gray, right? There is no light or dark side. We are in the middle. These are criminals we are dealing with. Have the character's actions reflect that. There are maybe one or two moments where I felt like the Outlaw and Kay really came out, only for the next cutscene to ruin that because they opted for the typical Star Wars protagonist who must crack a joke even in dire circumstances. This is a game that is about the darker side of the galaxy, the one you don't get to know too much about, where you get to see individuals get brutally killed. Think of Andor or Rogue One. Don't try to lean into the darker elements by having a plucky upstart not get changed by the things she experiences to advance her goals, because that's ultimately what she's trying to do. She's trying to escape her life, but she's constantly showing that she's more than that, and that's kind of weird for a person who's trying to be an outlaw, trying to do something strictly selfish. Kay Vess comes off as far too clean at times, and I wonder if the narrative would have been better off with a character that you could create and shape. So let's say you disagree with my assessment of Kay and you argue that she is a product of the narrative. Therein lies the real issue with Star Wars Outlaws. There is no real risk here. This is a safe, feel-good story that feels right at home with some of the franchise's biggest blockbusters, and it does not mesh with the grounded tone. This section is going to have spoilers for the ending of Star Wars Outlaws, so be warned. So to start, the narrative takes a while to get going. The opening hours of the game really focus on you trying to acclimate to the mechanics and the different systems, and this goes on for a while, so you might forget what Kay is ultimately trying to accomplish. And this was humorous because I had forgotten that she had a death mark on her because nobody tried to turn me in, and the bounty on Kay was supposed to be massive and placed on her by the biggest syndicate in the galaxy. Now, as you progress, you'll get recruited to build a heist team. And I swear to everyone, I feel like this is where the game was going to really take risks as your character and crew truly do operate outside the law. I got really excited for this, but that's just not how it is. I went in expecting Andor or Rogue One. Instead, I got something that falls in line with a very safe Star Wars story filled with paper-thin characters and contrivances. While some of these characters like Ankh are cool as hell, they are given nothing to do for the bulk of the game. Once you save them, you'll have a couple conversations, you might see them on the ship and interact with them, but that's it. All that is optional. The big twist found in Outlaws lack impact because they are heavily telegraphed. The biggest syndicate in the galaxy, being an Imperial spy group, should have been a massive reveal. It should have shook you to your core. Instead, it got hinted at heavily during multiple missions, which then ruins the surprise. Your benefactor, Jalen, betraying you was practically a given. If you could not see it happening, then you weren't paying attention to how betrayal was practically happening at every major point in the game, and just how sleazy his character was. Maybe the plot never interested you in the first place. It never really grabbed you, which is completely understandable because, there's a long period of time between you actually completing the first heist mission and then you actually doing something relevant. So I understand. Regardless, Jalen is a walking trope, and that type of character can be found everywhere in Star Wars. To me, the narrative had an opportunity to stand out on its own if your choices mattered, and maybe if there was a morality system. It was clear that the developer wasn't willing to take risks with the Star Wars name, and this really frustrated me because they shoehorned Darth Vader into the story for no other reason than the name recognition and shock value. It's a random moment, but it actually lessens the impact of revealing that Slero, the primary antagonist, is actually an Imperial, even though the main antagonist secretly being an Imperial is a constantly used trope in Star Wars. The narrative ultimately becomes far too familiar and predictable at the end. And for whatever reason, and this part really bothered me, Rico, who is Kay's mother and had seemingly abandoned her earlier, shows up at the end and becomes the crew's second slicer. I honestly believe that this was only done because the game up until that point lacked emotional weight. So they decided to throw her in there to add depth when better writing would have sufficed. Kay rightfully keeps her at an arm's length, and it feels like this is the point where her character is going to show that she has learned from all of the betrayal that's taken place. It might have been a little too late, but I think that some growth in that regard would have been greatly appreciated. Unfortunately, she doesn't, but here's the thing, I understand why. Because it's her mom, and even though she was abandoned, she carries the token that was gifted to her all those years ago. So when I saw this in the game, I said to myself, I'm gonna let this slide, it's okay. But Rico's inclusion near the end is far too late to be meaningful, and outside of a few cutscenes of her character, we don't know anything about her. And there's just not enough time for Kay and Rico to interact where it's going to lead to this emotional impact for the player. It just doesn't end up happening that way. While I think that this is a lazy decision, and one that really frustrated me because of just how obvious it was that they were trying to go for that emotional heart pull, I would venture to say that this isn't even the most underwhelming part of the narrative. That spot belongs to the final part of the game, which to me felt rushed, and it ends in a place where I felt like wasn't necessary or relevant to Kay's story, because the entire time it really felt like this should have ended at the casino. Let me explain. At the end of the game, Kay and her crew have pulled off an improbable heist, and instead of money, Kay discovers that what was stolen was Sliro's codex, which includes Imperial secrets, blackmail on Imperial officers, and valuable information on the other syndicates. In the right hands, it is worth millions. Kay is obviously upset because she was betrayed by the rebellion, and even though it's for a good cause, because the Empire sucks, she's still very upset. And she was also betrayed by Rico and Jalen, who unsurprisingly masterminded the whole thing. If you couldn't see that coming, I just don't know what to tell you. After a tense conversation, she gets knocked out by ND5 acting on the orders of Jalen due to the restrictor bolt that was placed on them. When Kay regains consciousness, she is rescued by Ankh and Jadik, and it turns out that she is on a Star Destroyer known as the Revelator. Instead of leaving at the behest of Jadik and Ankh, who have pretty much told her, hey, we lost, she decides to rescue ND5, and while that type of loyalty is appreciated, it would take an amazing plan, one that is flawless, to pull off this rescue attempt. Instead, you are treated to what I'm going to describe as a series of conveniences. Now, this is the end mission, and there are a number of loose threads still out there, so you are going to have to wrap this up. Kay's plan was to disguise herself as a stormtrooper, use Jadik as a prisoner, intimidate an officer to let them pass, and then ultimately find ND5 and Jalen. Because Sliro was left alive after the heist, which, by the way, was an incredibly stupid decision, he needs to make an appearance as well because up until this point, he is the big bad. Sliro is just conveniently summoned to the Revelator, and instead of having a set guard escort, Kay just forces her way into it, which, I mean, sure, whatever. They all make their way to the bridge, and this is where we learn that Jalen and Sliro are siblings, which would be a big twist, massive, if Jalen didn't wax poetic about his family before the heist at the casino. Why there isn't any subtlety in regard to the writing in this game, I will never know. Regardless, the two have an exposition-laced conversation about family and betrayal, and it's just not relevant to you or Kay, so who cares? Because ND5 ends up shooting Sliro, and it looks like Jalen is going to have the power that he believes he is owed. Instead of Kay waiting to let ND5 get close so that she can push this device she got from Jadik into the restraining bolt that would set ND5 free, she jumps the gun and reveals herself too early because of course she does. What's funny is that she doesn't shoot the gun out of ND5's hand. I'm serious, she turns, shoots the stormtrooper next to her, and then turns to face ND5, and then waits so that he can shoot the gun out of her hand. It is overall a really stupid and insulting moment, and the only way you succeed afterwards is because she is going to fail upwards like she has throughout the entirety of the game. ND5 then chases you, and you complete this really convoluted process to free them from Jalen's control. Now, that entire section wasn't bad, but it is kind of funny because ND5 the entire time is like, run, Kay, run, and I'm like, okay, whatever. Once you get him free, ND5 then shoots Jalen, and then Jalen just dies. Thankfully, there is no death monologue because I would have gotten really annoyed at that point. Anyway, the crew then makes a relatively clean escape through the Star Destroyer, and as you're trying to escape with your crew intact, Kay decides to have a change of heart about the rebellion. Because up until this point, she does not like them. She shits on them constantly, even after being betrayed and lied to multiple times. So what she does is that you have this really big fight scene, and you decide to call in one of the syndicates to assist you and the rebels. So regardless of what Kay said throughout the story, because she makes it clear on Tatooine and other places that she does not trust the rebellion, she does not like them, she doesn't view them any differently from the Empire, she is a good person. And instead of having the choice of leaving them to their own devices, Kay and her crew are heroes. And I think what you actually do here is very integral to the battle between the rebels and the Empire. So instead of having this self-contained story, which would have just had Kay on her own doing her own thing and us seeing the dark side of the galaxy, this criminal side, we get something more akin to like Solo or any other Star Wars property, which to me is just massively disappointing because it's a safe and feel-good ending that feels out of place given the work of your character. Everything about this ending and the events leading up to the final mission just felt rushed, and it felt out of place. For one, Jalen isn't a fleshed out character in the slightest, and because the game makes betrayal commonplace, it was almost a given that he was going to, in time, betray you. He's a walking red flag. The dude screamed secret bad guy the entire time. It was just slapped across his forehead. Kay's obsession with the crew at the end feels kind of forced because the characters don't feel close to one another. ND5 is really the only crew member that is prominently featured throughout the game and is the only one who develops a real connection with Kay, so I can see why she is desperate to save them. That made sense. But for the rest of the crew, you only do like one mission and then they trust you. And maybe there's some bonding you don't see off screen or whatever, but I really doubt it. Slero being in an Imperial is an overused trope, and Jalen being his brother felt like it was only included for shock value, even though you literally have no emotional connection to either of them. So who cares that they're brothers? The only reason Slero is at the Star Destroyer in the first place is because for some reason he wasn't killed at the casino. And at that point, it didn't make sense at all because the game sets up the casino heist as the finale for the game, which to me would have been a really good decision, as that is where Kay's journey began as an outlaw. I fully expected Jalen's betrayal to be shown here alongside the killing of Slero. I also expected some of your crew members would get killed because of the stakes, and this would ultimately culminate in a showdown with you and Jalen. Would that have been cliche? Yes. But is it better than the randomness of this ending with the destruction of a Star Destroyer? Also yes. It's clear that Kay wants nothing to do with the Empire or Rebellion. She's just a character caught up in the middle of this conflict. She's not even the most qualified character either. She just fails upward until the game reaches its safe conclusion. All of this could have been mitigated if choice played a factor in this game. Instead, you get a predictable ending, but one that takes place in the wrong setting. Star Wars Outlaws did not have to end this way. It did not need to include Vader or any Imperial presence for that matter in the narrative. It didn't have to be so predictable or convenient in the end. It could have been fine on its own if the developers were willing to take risks and not play it so safe. It's not that this game isn't enjoyable. It just lacks impact in its biggest moments. It lacks subtlety in its storytelling and doesn't fully flesh out a system that could have impacted both the narrative and gameplay. There is a universe where the Syndicate System changes the way Ubisoft games are played moving forward. Instead, what's here can be easily gamed and feels shallow. There is nothing wrong with creating a safe title, but Star Wars Outlaws felt like it could have been something more, but instead, you've seen this story before. You've played this type of game before, it just so happens to have Star Wars slapped onto the title. It's unfortunate that this is more than likely what held it back in the end, because I feel like under different circumstances, that maybe this game would have been similar to a title like Red Dead Redemption, but instead it's more like Watch Dogs, which I think anyone who's played that game will know that that's a really safe Ubisoft title. It had really good ideas and intentions when it was first announced, but when the game came out, it was really held back by half-hearted execution. If Star Wars Outlaws is successful, which I fully expect it to be, maybe the sequel will do what this game didn't and really embrace the criminal side of the galaxy. Maybe it will really embrace decision making and show impact there. Here's hoping that developer Massive takes more risks in Kay's next adventures. You're an outlaw, you need to live in the gray. I really think that's going to help the sequel elevate itself over other open world Ubisoft titles. But let me know what you think about Star Wars Outlaws in the comments. Let me know if you think this game is too safe. Just let me know what you think in general, because that's going to do it for this video. If you happen to like the content, please consider like, sharing, and subscribing. I am Ken from Pixelated Thoughts, and I will talk to you next time.